Guess what I'm holding? Get Your Mind Out of the Gutter. It's one of the first physical copies of my new book, Bloodlines, A History of Vampires. Let me show you the whole cover design and the way it wraps around to the spine. And you can see part of the image on the spine, and then it wraps around to the back. And this one got a little damaged in transit. They put it in the same box with a canister of protein powder that I ordered. So that's a nice sound, isn't it? I wanted to come on here and say something about this book because this is my fourth book, by the way. And over the last week or so, as I've been sharing the news about the publication of this book, I've gotten interesting reactions from people, and I think some people were surprised to see me write a book on a topic like the history of vampires. And the question that I've gotten the most is, what inspired you to write that? Well, the short answer to that question is just that I've been fascinated by vampires since, well, for as long as I can remember. I specifically remember the way that my imagination was lit up by the Anne Rice books, the Vampire Chronicles, Interview with the Vampire, The Vampire Lestat, Queen of the Damned. Those books, when I read them in high school, really captivated my imagination with the sort of world-weary vampires and their deviant desires and the guilt that they carry and their inner moral conflicts. And it was just a fascinating world that Anne Rice created in those books, and it really stayed with me for years and years. I remember also being really captivated by a particular movie about vampires called The Hunger with David Bowie and Catherine Deneuve. And I mean, how can you possibly go wrong with a vampire movie starring David Bowie and Catherine Deneuve? It's just a fantastic movie, really interesting twist about the immortality of the vampire and not being completely fail-safe. So part of the story is that for one of the characters, the immortality is failing, and he's aging very rapidly. And then of course it has that classic opening scene with Bauhaus performing their hit Bela Lugosi's Dead in a nightclub as David Bowie and Catherine Deneuve are hunting their next victim. Indelible impressions from that movie, highly recommended, 10 out of 10. And then I also remember much later as an adult being electrified by the depictions of vampires and other creatures, lots of other creatures, in HBO's series True Blood, and the hypersexualized, gleefully deviant depictions of vampires and their desires and their lifestyles and so on, and their ancient rivalries with other types of supernatural creatures, and a fascinating show for many reasons. But really, those were just some of my personal inspirations that have fed my imagination over the years, and those are just three examples that I kind of pulled out of thin air, the ones that come to mind first. But if you take a glance, any passing glance at popular culture these days, vampires are everywhere. And they've taken all kinds of forms, and the vampire myth has proven to be so flexible and to be adaptable to so many different purposes and genres and audiences that it really is perhaps humanity's most successful and adaptable myth. It's been the basis of obviously horror movies. That's its most frequent way of being depicted, because vampires are associated with death and horror and all of that. But vampires have also been sanitized and carried over into popular culture in a way that, there are teenage vampires that go to high school. Um, there are kids shows that depict cute little vampires. So it's everywhere. And this book is not first and foremost a sort of catalog of vampire stories and their origins. It's really taking a deeper dive and looking at where does this vampire myth come from in the first place, and what does it mean to us as human beings, and why is it so persistent and universal? Um, so it takes a deep dive into the origins of the whole idea of vampires, looking way back a few thousand years at ancient people and the origins of the vampire myth in ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Greece, ancient China, ancient India. These ancient civilizations where people's fears about death and decomposition and superstition and folk magic and really nothing that we think of in a modern sense as a scientific understanding of contagion and disease and things like that. They didn't have that knowledge, and so they speculated and they projected superstitious ideas onto funeral practices and bodies and death and all of that. And that's really where some of the earliest vampire stories came from. And then of course it took on a much more pronounced form in places that we know in the modern age as the Baltics or Romania, specifically Transylvania, where the idea of the vampire really took on one of its familiar forms, the kind of Slavic vampire that became the basis of a lot of modern vampire stories and myths. All through the medieval ages, it was a very persistent way for people to look at death and deal with things that they couldn't understand. For example, when a particular family member would die of a contagious disease, and they didn't really understand what contagious disease was then, so that this person would pass away, and then one by one, the other family members of that person would begin to drop. And one of the ways that they came to understand this kind of thing happening was that the person who died first was coming back and taking the other family members. And then there's a whole chapter in the book that is about Bram Stoker and the legend of Dracula, which is really one of the ways that one of the myths, the uber myths about vampires, the template for so many of our modern ways of understanding the vampire, the symbolism of the vampire. There's a chapter that looks at vampires in the cinema, and Nosferatu, the cinematic depictions of Dracula, including, by the way, a recent and very good remake of Nosferatu 100 years after the original by one of my favorite directors, Robert Eggers. And then there's a chapter that looks at sort of very contemporary depictions of vampires in film and TV, so Twilight and Buffy the Vampire Slayer and all these kinds of things. There is finally a whole chapter that looks at the underlying symbolism of the vampire and why it's crossed into so many of these mediums, and how it symbolizes things that are difficult for us to talk about otherwise. So capitalism and authoritarianism and sexuality and addiction and forbidden desires and all of these things get projected onto the vampire and acted out in ways that we need our myths to act those things out in our imagination. So that's one of the roles that the vampire serves. So that's just a little overview of some of the stuff that's in this book. I hope you'll go get your own copy. It's at Amazon um, in paperback, audiobook, and Kindle formats. And by the way, también está disponible en español. It's available in Spanish in all three of those formats: paperback, audiobook, and Kindle. So go get your copy and let me know if you have any questions. And by the way, it's out just in time for Halloween, so I hope it makes your spooky season a little bit spookier and a little more meaningful.